The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Today's hearing continues the important oversight work we began in February by taking a closer look at the Chinese Communist Party's growing footprint in Cuba and the implications for U.S. Homeland Security. With Beijing ramping up its economic, military, and intelligence operations just 90 miles from our coastline, this is no longer a distant challenge. It's an immediate concern for the security of the American people. The United States must urgently understand the full extent of this threat, ensure that the Department of Homeland Security and its interagency partners are equipped to address it, and take a hard look at our broader strategic partner throughout the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. Today, the subcommittee convenes to examine an alarming threat developing just 90 miles off our coast. Mounting evidence suggests that the Chinese Communist Party is expanding its strategic partnership with the totalitarian communist regime in Cuba to build advanced surveillance infrastructure capable of targeting the United States. This collaboration represents one of the most brazen intelligence operations ever attempted near the American mainland and places our military operations, commercial activity, and communication squarely in the crosshairs of a hostile foreign power. Recent satellite imagery and open source analysis suggest the presence of several Chinese-funded signals and intelligence facilities across Cuba. The possibility that these sites are capable of monitoring U.S. military operations, commercial shipping, space launches, and sensitive communications is deeply troubling. Southeastern United States is home to some of the most critical assets in our nation's security infrastructure, from the Space Launch Center at Cape Canaveral to the headquarters of U.S. Southern Command in Miami. This region plays a critical role in our defense posture. This region includes my own district, which has long been on the front lines of threats emerging from the Cuban regime. If the Chinese government is in fact leveraging a growing partnership with Cuba to collect intelligence on our activities, that is a threat that we can no longer ignore. Cuba's government has a long history of working with foreign adversaries to undermine the United States. What we are potentially witnessing today is a new and dangerous phase of that cooperation that is fueled by Havana's economic desperation and Beijing's strategic ambition. The Cuban regime remains a state sponsor of terrorism, harbors fugitives from the U.S. justice system, and relentlessly suppresses the rights of its own people. Its growing reliance on foreign authoritarian powers like China only adds to the danger. Over the past several months, I've taken steps to raise alarms about the malign activities of the Communist government of Cuba. In March, I sent a letter to the Department of Homeland Security requesting an investigation into individuals in the United States suspected of links to Cuban intelligence and the Communist Party. These networks have long operated on U.S. soil and may now be intersecting with China's activities in the region. Shortly after, in April, I sent a letter to the Department of Treasury calling for a full suspension of U.S.-Cuba travel and remittances with appropriate humanitarian exceptions. We should not be funding a regime that turns around and opens its doors to our greatest adversaries. If reports of rising Chinese activity in Cuba are accurate, then it is no longer just a diplomatic issue. It is a direct security risk to the American people. This hearing is the first step in understanding the scope of this threat. Today, our witnesses will help us assess the potential scale of the threat and what measures the federal government should take to stay ahead of it. We need to be clear-eyed about the risks and both swift and unified in our response. The United States cannot afford to overlook the possibility that a hostile foreign power is working hand-in-hand with a communist dictatorship in Cuba to employ advanced surveillance capabilities on our doorstep. It is our responsibility to ensure that the homeland remains secure, and not just from what we can see, but from what may be gathering just out of sight. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee. I look forward to a productive discussion on how the United States can counter the Chinese Communist Party and their suspected surveillance efforts in Cuba and prevent our adversaries from gaining a strategic foothold so close to our homeland. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. McIver, for her opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. The threats posed by the People's Republic of China towards the United States require serious attention as China works aggressively to gain a foothold within the Caribbean. In Cuba, China has provided almost $8 billion in monetary incentives over the past 20 years, seeking to strengthen ties with the country just 90 miles from U.S. shores. China has invested heavily in Cuba's infrastructure, technology, communications, and biotechnology. Within the transportation and maritime sectors, Cuba has benefited from China's partnership by gaining security equipment for airports, seaports, and customs facilities. Newtek, Newtek Company, a Chinese state-owned company, has provided inspection technology to be installed throughout much of Cuba's transportation networks. The Department of Homeland Security has assessed that Newtek screening systems likely have deficiencies in detection capabilities, and China the Department of Homeland Security has assessed that Newtek screening systems likely have deficiencies in detection capabilities, and that China could potentially access the systems remotely to gather intelligence on shipping, manifests, and passenger information. In 2021, Cuba signed onto China's Belt and Road Initiative, and now China is further developing sites in Cuba to collect intelligence on the United States through monitoring of ship movements, emails, phone calls, and radio and satellite transmissions. The knowledge of these sites is not new, as U.S. security officials have confirmed awareness of their existence since at least the first Trump administration. The United States and our partners face tremendous challenges in responding to China's aggression. A solid partnership among the United States and Latin America allies aids in advancing U.S. interests in the region and strengthening our national security. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is actively undermining those efforts. By suspending foreign aid and dismantling USAID, the Trump administration has weakened our national security, allowing China to apply influence within Latin America without competition. In year 2023, USAID dedicated $1.8 billion in funding to the Western Hemisphere, including funding to support independent Cuban media organizations providing objective, uncensored journalism. The dismantling of foreign aid programs benefits authoritarian governments like the Cuban regime by undermining groups working to advance human rights and democratic ideals. To make matters worse, President Trump has ceded significant power to an unelected billionaire in Elon Musk, whose deep ties with the PRC are cause for great concern. I am glad there is bipartisan agreement on the need to counter China's aggressive activities in Cuba and Latin America. That said, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in speaking out about how the Trump administration is actively undermining efforts to counter the PRC and advance U.S. interests around the globe. Thank you again for our witnesses joining us today. With that, I yield back.
Thank you to the ranking member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to hold a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Dr. Ryan Berg is the Director of the Americas Program and the head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Berg specializes in U.S. Latin America relations, strategic competition, defense policy, and transnational organized crime. Previously, he was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at Oxford's Changing Character of War program. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy and a Master of Philosophy in Political Science, a Master of Science in Global Governance from Oxford, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Government and Theology from Georgetown. Andres Martinez-Fernandez is the Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America with the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for the National Security. In this role, he leads the Heritage Foundation's work on U.S. policy towards Latin America, conducting research and engaging audiences on topics such as economic development, foreign aid, transnational organized crime, and the malign activities of the Communist China and other extra-regional actors. Before joining Heritage, Andres was a leading analyst at a leading global market intelligence firm where he advised top executives from multinational companies on political and macroeconomic risks in Latin America. He received his master's degree in Latin American Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and his bachelor's degree is in history from Florida International University, a university which I represent. Leland Lazarus serves as Associate Director of National Security at Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute of Public Policy. He's an expert on China-Latin American relations and manages a team of researchers and interns that collect data and analysis on U.S. national security and governance in Latin America and the Caribbean. From 2021 to 2022, Leland served as a special assistant and speechwriter to the commander of U.S. Southern Command. Before that, Leland was a State Department Foreign Service officer, serving as Deputy Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, Consular Officer at the U.S. Consul General in Shenyang, China, and Pickering Fellow at U.S. Embassy Beijing and at the China Desk in D.C. Fluent in both Mandarin and Spanish, he holds a Master of Arts in U.S.-China Foreign Policy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Brown University. I want to thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Dr. Berg for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McIver, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to share my views with you on this important topic this morning. A mere 90 miles off our shores, the United States' most formidable 21st century competitor, the People's Republic of China, has found fertile soil to deploy its arsenal of espionage, digital surveillance, and maritime competition. In many ways, a moribund socialist system in Havana is Beijing's perfect partner for threatening the U.S. homeland, especially as a response to U.S. posture in the Indo-Pacific. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to focus my oral testimony on China's signals intelligence capabilities, while recognizing that the relationship between Beijing and Havana runs much deeper. I know my colleagues on this panel will cover other aspects of the relationship, maritime, telecommunications, and so on, which I'm happy, of course, to discuss in our question period. When Soviet influence diminished on the island following the end of the Cold War, eyes, ears, and antennas stayed. In many ways, China filled the void. On June 8, 2023, the Wall Street Journal first reported that Cuba hosted secret Chinese spy bases in return for billions of dollars for the Cuban regime. That same day, the Biden administration's Defense Department denied the Wall Street Journal's reporting, characterizing the report as, quote, inaccurate. 3 days later, however, the NSC spokesperson, John Kirby, reversed course and admitted to China's spy bases in Cuba, but said that its presence had existed since 2019 under the first Trump administration, implying that the Biden admin had inherited this challenge. Around the same time, reports surfaced that China was pursuing the construction of a military training base in Cuba. CSIS then published a groundbreaking report called Secret Signals, decoding China's intelligence activities in Cuba. The CSIS team scoured the island using commercially available satellite imagery, identifying 4 likely sites for signals intelligence collection in that process. This was followed by a Wall Street Journal exclusive, confirming its earlier reporting on the spy stations. CSIS published another updated set of images in December 2024 and has tracked China's progress at these 4 sites. As part of this hearing, Mr. Chairman, we're pleased to release some updated imagery, and I think we have a slideshow here for you to see. As you can see on this first slide, Mr. Chairman, CSIS positively identified about 4 specific facilities as highly likely sites supporting Chinese intelligence operations targeting the U.S. 3 of these sites, Bejucal, Wahai, and Calabasar, are located around Havana. A 4th site, El Salao, is a previously unreported facility located on the opposite side of the island, just east of Santiago de Cuba. In response to reporting on the Cuba-China SIGINT nexus, high-level Cuban Communist Party officials either outright denied any relationship or attempted to disarm our criticism with humor. To coincide with this hearing, Mr. Chairman, we have some updated imagery that we can show you. Next slide, please. After the publication of our initial reports, construction progress at El Salao, the site by Santiago de Cuba, seems to have ceased according to the image captures dated April 18th, 2025. If you can go to the next slide, please. The CDAA site appears to have been abandoned for the moment, as evidenced by hitherto well-trimmed and graded areas being taken over by grass. On the next slide, the PRC appears to be enhancing its SIGINT at a previously identified facility at Beijing. And on the next slide, you can see an antenna field from the original CSIS image captures. And on our last slide, Mr. Chairman, you can see the latest CSIS image captures shows those antennas have been removed to make way for a large CDAA site, very similar to the one that was originally visible at El Salao. The Beijing facility is very, very active, as evidenced by multiple image captures in this process. So as you can see, Mr. Chairman, our adversaries are at our doorstep. I want to use the rest of the time remaining to mention some brief recommendations for the committee to consider. First, I think a classified briefing to every member of Congress should be given, given the significance of these developments to U.S. national security. Second, the U.S. should consider strategic declassification of images in its possession, given that El Salao appears to have been abandoned after the CSIS publication of its report. We may reasonably believe that transparency efforts and public criticism do have the potential to derail some of the PRC's ambitions. Third, develop and articulate red lines. It may be difficult to displace some of these existing facilities from the island, but the United States should be crystal clear that the permanent installation of offensive military capabilities in Cuba or the basing of PLA combat assets would be seen as a significant escalation and a red line for the United States. An inability to deter SIGINT facilities should not be interpreted by Havana as a green light for China. Fourth, I think we need to harden sensitive infrastructure against SIGINT collection by China. The CISA should spearhead an effort to review which companies and facilities in the area are most vulnerable to intelligence gathering operations. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to enlist neighbors and allies. These facilities do not just snoop on the United States. CDAAs collect information omnidirectionally, meaning that other countries in the Caribbean, including those that Secretary of State Marco Rubio met on his recent successful trip to the Caribbean, are also implicated. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield, and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you, Dr. Berg, and I recognize Mr. Martinez-Fernandez for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez and Ranking Member McIver. I appreciate the invitation and apologize for my tardiness. My name is Andres Martinez. I run the Latin America portfolio at the Heritage Foundation. Since its inception, the Cuban dictatorship has repeatedly proven itself to be a willing partner and staging ground for anti-American extra-hemispheric powers. Today, Havana offers itself as a partner for a new patron, the Chinese Communist Party. Reporting by CSIS and other organizations have once again unmasked the malign nature of the Beijing-Havana nexus, particularly the growing footprint of Chinese intelligence gathering facilities in Cuba. China's accelerating espionage partnership with Cuba poses a major threat for U.S. and hemispheric security, bringing together Beijing's resources and technology with Havana's troubling capacity to penetrate U.S. agencies and security institutions. The growth of China's spying footprint in Cuba is also indicative of Beijing's broader malign presence in the Americas. While economic engagement has led the way for China's advance in much of Latin America and the Caribbean, Beijing's influence has spread quickly into the political, clandestine, and military spheres. China's broader influence has also allowed it to expand its regional intelligence gathering capacities beyond Cuba, including in democratic nations. Indeed, Beijing has even secured unusually sprawling embassies in the Caribbean, such as in Antigua and Bahamas and beyond, with sites that are widely considered to be active intelligence centers for China. In Argentina and elsewhere in South America, Beijing has also established deep space monitoring facilities with worrying military implications. China's strategic focus around dual use and critical infrastructure in the Americas highlights the intrinsic military and security nature of China's hemispheric encroachment. Chinese infrastructure projects across Latin America and the Caribbean offer Beijing crucial vectors for espionage and disruptive operations in and around the US. Control over ports and other infrastructure can even be leveraged to impede the movement of US warships, military resources, or directly target US assets and supply chains. Beijing's inroads in the Caribbean may be the most concerning aspect of its hemispheric encroachment. Geographic proximity to the United States and around crucial U.S. maritime routes make the Caribbean of outsized strategic importance for the United States. China appears to recognize this strategic importance given the relative attention and engagement Beijing has given to the region, both economically and politically. As with Pacific Island nations, Beijing seeks to consolidate its influence over strategically important island chains in the Caribbean. The end goal of this effort is apparently counterbalancing the U.S. presence in Asia and empowering China to destabilize the U.S. through asymmetric means. As Beijing grows increasingly belligerent against Taiwan and U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. must assume that China will operationalize its presence and influence in Latin America and the Caribbean against the United States. China's gains in the Caribbean and beyond pose an urgent challenge for U.S. national security. The Trump administration has clearly moved to confront the hemispheric vulnerability posed by China and its partnership with the communist dictatorship in Cuba, among other actors. Confronting these threats requires rallying pressure against Beijing and Havana while bolstering partnerships with regional democracies across economic, political, and security spheres. The United States should bolster its security cooperation and capacities, in particular within Latin America and the Caribbean, prioritizing initiatives that mitigate risks posed to vital infrastructure and other vulnerabilities. At the same time, the U.S. should leverage its underappreciated territorial presence in the Caribbean. U.S. territories, particularly including Puerto Rico, can be better used to counterbalance Chinese and Cuban malign activities in the Caribbean and across Latin America. Bolstering the U.S. Coast Guard presence capacities in Puerto Rico, for example, will support U.S. security in the broader Caribbean region amid these growing threats. U.S. territories can also be used as force multipliers in bolstering broader U.S. economic engagement in Latin America and the Caribbean through targeted measures that offset regional dependence on China. Thank you very much for the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez-Fernandez. Now I recognize Mr. Lazarus for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member MacIver, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the privilege to speak today. My name is Leland Lazarus. I'm the Associate Director of Florida International University's Gordon Institute for Public Policy and non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. I come to you today not just as a researcher, but as someone who has observed this threat evolve firsthand. First, from my time as a Fulbright scholar, studying the Chinese diaspora in Panama, to serving as a State Department Foreign Service officer in China and the Caribbean, to serving as a special assistant and speechwriter to 2 combatant commanders at U.S. Southern Command. So let me be clear, Cuba is not just an outpost of Chinese influence. It's a strategic beachhead. As my colleagues have said time and time again, just 90 miles off Florida, where I live, where I reside, the Chinese Communist Party is executing a 21st century playbook of espionage, port infrastructure, space surveillance, and digital authoritarianism. And Havana is the perfect laboratory for China. China has built signals intelligence outposts aimed at Florida, as the CSIS report has shown, but it has also installed airport scanners and surveillance equipment using Chinese firms like NukTech, as Ranking Member MacIver had mentioned. It's a state-owned company sanctioned by the US for ties to the Chinese military. NukTech systems are deployed across Cuban airports, seaports, and customs facilities, giving Beijing privileged access to sensitive data flows right on our doorstep. But what's happening in Cuba is just one chapter in a much larger story. Next week, on May 13th, Beijing will host the China-CELAC Summit with nearly every country in Latin America and the Caribbean represented in Beijing. It's a reminder that China has a long-term strategy for this hemisphere, built on patient investment, diplomatic cultivation, and evolving security ties. The US, unfortunately, by contrast, still too often operates from a crisis-to-crisis mindset in this region and has yet to provide an affirmative, long-term agenda for the region at large. The Chinese military and military scholars call countries like Cuba strategic support points, or 战略支点in Mandarin, to sustain their far seas naval posture. They don't need permanent bases, they need leverage. And Cuba gives them exactly that. It's close, politically reliable, and already outfitted with Chinese tech. When the US sends warships through the Taiwan Straits, Chinese academics now reply with references to their own right to operate near Florida. That's strategic reciprocity, Beijing style. You touch our waters, we have the right to touch yours. China also aspires to build its 四天 space program to expand its global space domain awareness. But space is also crucial for signals intelligence, and Cuba is a prime location for China to target the US. That's why we at Florida International University has created the Chinese Activities in Latin America dashboard in order to track and expose China's moves in almost real time. It maps everything, and I mean everything, from dual-use ports and signals intelligence listening stations to companies like NukeTech that quietly expand China's operational footprint across the region. Our dashboard that we built is really built for you all, US policymakers, to make the best decisions about our greatest strategic competitor. But it's also a warning. China's not just coming to Latin America and the Caribbean. It's already here, and it's here to stay. Members of the subcommittee, we cannot win a global competition with China if we lose sight of our own hemisphere. Strategic neglect is not just dangerous, it is a gift we give to Beijing. We must meet this challenge together with our allies and partners to make America and the Americas safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lazarus. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'll start out with a comment in that the United States, for far too long, both Republican and Democrat administrations have not paid close enough attention to what's happening in our own hemisphere. And it's allowed China to make the inroads that it has. And now we're just waking up to the fact. And so this hearing is part of that, to try to awaken the American people and the administration to the fact that we need to pay close attention to what's happening in our own neighborhood. And so with that, this is an open question. It's my estimation that the Cuban regime itself is actually in one of the most weakest positions that it has been in the past 60 years. Do any of you share that opinion, or do you disagree with that opinion? I'll start with you, Dr. Berg.
Thanks for the question, Chairman. I do share that opinion. I think the Cuban regime is incredibly weak at this point in time, and we've seen that not just in protests from the island, but in rolling blackouts that occur seemingly on a monthly basis, sometimes weekly basis, Mr. Chairman. Mr.
Fernandez.
Yes, I agree. I think economically, politically as well, the Cuban regime is in a period of vulnerability. I think also increasingly hemispheric as well as U.S. Political consensus is moving towards a recognition of the malign nature of the Cuban dictatorship, as past attempts, however, poorly conceived at engagement, as we have seen from the U.S., have fallen flatly and been rebuffed, and the Cuban dictatorship has, at the same time, again, as we have discussed, acted as an active partner for enemies of the United States within our hemisphere.
Mr. Lazarus, do you share that opinion that the Cuban regime is at one of the weakest points in the last 60 years?
Sir, I'd absolutely agree. Inflation is almost 30% for the Cuban regime. There's been an increased outflow of refugees coming out of Cuba, and there's been an increase in Cuban officials traveling to Beijing, trying to get more investment. I understand that now China is Cuba's either largest or second largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 30% of Cuba's imports and exports. So I think that Cuba's decreasing economic situation is allowing it to become even more and more dependent economically and increasingly security and political standpoint on China.
Now, I'd like to discuss you off with the three of you offline and how we can accelerate the dictatorship, their demise, so we can turn Cuba from a platform and a base for China and make it actually a friend of the United States. And I think we're close to that. I also think that Cuba is the head of the snake. When we talk about all the unrest that's happening in our hemisphere in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba's the head of the snake. And we need to do everything in our power to set the Cuban people free, but also turn Cuba from an enemy into a friend. Now, let's talk about Cuba and the threat and the Chinese threat in Cuba. The Russians have been operating there for years, decades. Are the Chinese supplanting the Russians, or are they adding to the Russian threat?
I'm happy to take that, Mr. Chairman. I think that they're both supplanting but also adding to. There's still a residual Russian presence, of course, in Cuba. We saw last year at the tail end of the Biden administration how the Russians sailed a vessel through the Florida Strait, ported both in Cuba and in Havana. Importantly, before porting in Cuba, displayed one of its Zircon hypersonic missiles in the Atlantic. But I would say in terms of the presence, Mr. Chairman, the Chinese have supplanted them in terms of the more important partner. And quite literally, some of these sites that we've showed were former Russian sites that are now occupied, we believe, by the Chinese.
And they've added to the capabilities, more modern infrastructure, et cetera.
That's correct.
Okay, and so maybe some of my colleagues would be surprised to know that not only is it Russia and China, but also Iran is here, and North Korea is also here, and so we need to also stand up to those threats. The training range that's just outside of Florida, it's the largest training range that we have. It's the only training range that actually can simulate battle in the Taiwan Straits. What kind of a threat do these facilities pose to those ranges, and what kind of intelligence could the Chinese get from surveying those ranges in relation to our tactics, et cetera, of how we may operate in the Taiwan Straits?
Mr. Chairman, the first slide that I showed in my presentation showed just the number of facilities in your home state that are easily within range of these facilities. It's my understanding that military communications is, of course, encrypted and protected in certain ways. But if it's scooped up by some of this equipment, then it is available for the Chinese to try to crack that communication. And so that's why one of my recommendations is doing an exercise to harden facilities and figure out what our vulnerabilities are, so that we can make sure that we protect those very vulnerable secrets, both on the commercial side and on the military side, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. My 5 minutes are up, and I recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Mrs. McIver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lazarus, thank you once again for joining us today. In your testimony, you discussed how China will be hosting a summit with Latin America and Caribbean states next week. China and Cuba also both belong to the BRICS group, along with Brazil, Russia, India, and a total of 23 countries. BRICS has become a serious political force as the nations belonging to BRICS now account for almost 30% of the world's GDP, 40% of the oil production, and almost half the world's population. We have seen what Trump's repeated tariff threats are doing to the economy, both at home and globally, while eroding trust in the US dollar. Trump's foreign policies are only making groups like the BRICS more powerful as our geopolitical rivals work to fill the void that President Trump has created with this America Last policies. Mr. Lazarus, as America recedes from the world stage, how are BRICS and other multinational groups exerting power and influence?
Well, Ranking Member, thank you so much for the question. You're absolutely right. I mean, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, when taken together, they represent more than 30% of global GDP. And they've really been using this multilateral institution in order to create alternative financial institutions to the Western-built ones built right after World War II. So you think the New Development Bank or the BRICS Bank that could fund various projects in the developing world. There's talk about them creating a BRICS currency that could mean that they can settle trade accounts not using the US dollar, which could potentially weaken the US dollar's dominance in the globe. But it goes to a larger narrative that the Chinese and our other adversaries try to use in the Global South, which is that the United States doesn't necessarily care about the Global South. All they care about is realist ideology, especially in this region in Latin America and the Caribbean. There is this narrative that the Chinese try to say, which is that the United States only wants to impose the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. And I am concerned that certain things, certain policies could really allow the Chinese to continue to spread that narrative in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you for that. Just a follow-up. In your opinion, do you think China ultimately stands to benefit from the pause in foreign aid underneath the Trump administration?
Well, we're seeing already on a global scale that China has already stepped up its foreign aid in countries like Cambodia, Nepal. As I mentioned, next week they're going to be hosting the fourth ministerial of the China-CELAC summit. And I expect that after that summit, there's going to be a joint action plan between China and CELAC on China increasing exports of renewable energy and electric vehicles and solar panels. And again, it's another way for China to project itself as a reliable partner at a time where other countries are perceiving potentially the U.S. as tariffing other countries. And it's also a way for China to project itself as the defender of globalization and free trade going forward. That is a concern.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lazarus. With that, I yield back, Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Crane, for 5 minutes.
Thank you guys for coming today to talk about this very, very important topic. So just to get this straight, we have the Chinese partnering with Cuba, both communist countries, and Cuba's not, but what, roughly 90 miles from the United States. Are we able to discern through the satellite imagery, human intel, and signal intel what the capabilities of this technology located on Cuba, the island of Cuba? Dr. Berg?
Chairman, we're able to speculate about it, but again, this was discovered using commercially available satellite technology that we have the capability of using. I'm sure, and this is why I recommended a classified briefing for you all. On the high side, my guess is that there's a lot more analysis available on capabilities and vulnerabilities.
Do we have the ability to jam and block the surveillance technologies located on the island of Cuba? Dr. Berg?
Congressman, it's my understanding that we do have some of that capability. I'm not sure if it is being deployed. And also, as I mentioned, some of the communications that are sensitive in nature are also encrypted, but I'm happy to talk to you sort of offline or answer questions further after this hearing about those types of capabilities.
Thank you. Mr. Lazarus, you mentioned that the Chinese could use these bases to project digital authoritarianism. I believe that was the word you used. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely, Congressman. Well, first and foremost, Huawei and ZTE provide the digital backbone for ETEXA, the Cuban telecommunications company. We saw in July of 2021, when there was the large, massive protests in Cuba against the regime, that the regime was able to really shut down the protesters' communications so that they couldn't necessarily collaborate with each other as easily as they otherwise would. And our assessment was that they were able to rely on the technology of Huawei and ZTE in order to shut that down. There's also, again, the idea of nuke tech being in various seaports, airports in Cuba. And nuke tech is a state-owned enterprise. It is a subsidiary of Tsinghua University's Tongfang, which China's National Nuclear Corporation has a 21% stake in nuke tech. And it provides all kinds of port scanning equipment. And the concern is that all the kind of information, whether it be biometric, whether it be commercial, whether it be sensitive data about supply chain routes and cargo flows, all that information can go back to Beijing, and that would constitute a national security threat for the United States.
Thank you. Dr. Berg, is it true that a Chinese national was arrested in January of this year in Miami's airport for conducting espionage activities?
Congressman, I'll have to get back to you on that. I'm not aware of that, that particular event.
Yeah, I'd like to enter this into the record, Mr. Chairman. This is an article, Chinese national targeted in federal spy investigation arrested at Miami International Airport. According to the article, he had transmitted 47 pages. There were schematics, graphs, diagrams related to nuclear weapons. Mr. Lazarus, I want to come back.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lazarus, I want to come back to you. Do you believe that the Chinese are engaged in unrestricted warfare with the United States, i.e. economic warfare, attacks on critical infrastructure, espionage, IP theft, etc.?
Congressman, we've seen evidence time and time again, whether it be the FBI under former Director Christopher Wray, talking about how China-based hackers, whether it be Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, have infiltrated critical infrastructure throughout the United States. And that would, of course, be a national security concern, and that they are potentially pre-positioning, if there is ever a conflict with the United States, say over the Straits of Taiwan or the South China Sea, that the Chinese could retaliate by shutting down some of that critical infrastructure. The concern is that many of the same tactics, some of the same companies that are concerned here in the United States are also operating in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Kennedy. Sorry, he left. Okay, and I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for being here today. I'm deeply concerned about the long-term consequences of the Trump-Musk administration's systemic dismantling of USAID, foreign aid, and other international development programs, actions that have significantly weakened America's global influence, especially on our own hemisphere. In the past several months, critical U.S. investments in diplomacy and development have been slashed, frozen, or redirected to serve narrow political goals. This isn't just bad policy. It was a strategic mistake that has had real consequences on our national security and regional stability. In Latin America, these decisions have been nothing short of a gift to authoritarian regimes in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. By retreating from our role as a champion of democracy and development, we left a vacuum that autocrats have rushed to fill. With China taking the lead, instead of supporting reformers and pro-democratic movements, we left them under-resourced and isolated. While despots like Nicolas Maduro tightened their grip, foreign aid is not a charity. It's a wise investment in stability, security, and American values. When we help communities thrive and support democratic institutions, we make it harder for authoritarianism, corruption, and extremism to take root. Cutting these programs undermines regional security and contributes to the very conditions, violence, poverty, and political repression that drive migration to our southern border. Rebuilding USAID and reaffirming our commitment to global development is not just morally right, it's strategically necessary. America must lead again, not just with the might of our military, but with the strength of our values and the reach of our engagement. Dr. Berg, given the maritime shipping is heavily dominated by Chinese vessels, including those coming in and out of U.S. ports, what kind of insight does that give the Chinese into maritime traffic in the U.S., and how could China use this information to our detriment?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I think we've seen multiple instances in which the Chinese have used ports as dual-use infrastructure, not just to have the PLA Navy make port calls in some of the deep water ports, but all of that data, that information that is contained in a port is important for the Chinese. The comings and goings of ships, cargo manifests, with what frequency. This is all very important if we're talking about building safe and secure supply chains as well. I had the privilege of being before this committee in February when we were talking about the very issue of ports, and this issue also came up then, specifically with reference to the Panama Canal, the two Hong Kong-based ports that are at the strategic approaches to the canal, also a critical issue, Congressman.
In your testimony, you recommended enlisting neighbors like Bahamas, Dominican Republic, and Jamaica to combat intelligence gathering from China and Cuba. How can federal international development assistance programs help achieve this goal?
Congressman, I would advocate that we build on Secretary of State Rubio's very successful visit to the Caribbean in recent weeks. I think it's important that the Secretary of State has already taken 2 trips to the region in just over 2.5 months of his time in office. And I think those countries, once made aware of the extent of Cuba's espionage activities and therefore their vulnerabilities, will be quite willing to partner with us. It's in their interest, just as it's in ours, not to have Cuba snooping on their signals intelligence.
Thank you. Mr. Lazarus, how can China use its investments in Cuba to disrupt shipping routes that lead to major U.S. ports, like the Port of New Orleans or the Port of Southeast Louisiana in my home state?
Well, I understand that those 2 ports in the United States represent about 20%, a little more than 20% of cargo entering to the U.S. And the concern is that whether it be a nuke tech, whether it be a China Harbor engineering company, because China Harbor and China Communication Construction Corporation also have key projects in Cuba. Those companies that have direct ties to the People's Liberation Army can gather information about U.S. port operations, cargo flows, potentially see our supply chain vulnerabilities. They can also use those areas as a way to issue cyber attacks or cyber disruptions in and around the port operations. And they could, of course, create plausible deniability, which is, of course, an MO that they've been doing for quite some time as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields, and I recognize the gentlewoman from South Carolina, Ms. Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests today for highlighting these important aspects of our topic today. So I have personally been to Key West and involved in military training there, so this topic really does catch my attention. Also, I would like to say that I'm excited about our current administration, the ideas of increasing our innovation and rebuilding our military and strengthening our defense for the very purpose of this. U.S. intelligence officials, military strategists, and regional experts have drawn parallels between China's current activity and the Cold War era use of Cuba by the Soviet Union as a forward surveillance outpost. Yet the tools of today, especially in digital surveillance, constitute a sophisticated threat of a different order. So my first question is for Mr. Martinez-Fernandez. Are China's activities in Cuba more reminiscent of Cold War-style strategic encirclement, or are they more aligned with a new model of digital influence and persistent surveillance?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think that there are many aspects of China's engagement in Cuba that are reminiscent of the Cold War era engagement by the Soviet Union. And they align primarily with, or often with military and geostrategic aims for those reasons. I think, certainly we're seeing an increased leveraging of modern technologies as well as the more deep economic ties that China has globally as compared to maybe the Soviet Union as a part of what's being leveraged in Latin America and the Caribbean and with Cuba to create this kind of broader surveillance and operational infrastructure for China. And that raises many concerns because we obviously we saw the consequences and the risks during the Cold War of this this presence from hostile extrahemispheric actors just 90 miles off of our shores. And we're seeing that, I think, at a new level, as I said, because of these new and in some ways expanded capacities that the Chinese government can employ because of its resources, because of its capacities.
Thank you. So my next question is for Dr. Berg. Could China's posture in Cuba serve as a springboard for influencing or disrupting U.S. diplomatic or military efforts outside the region, such as in the Indo-Pacific?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I think it's critical. We hope this never happens, but if there is a conflict in a different theater of the world, let's say there's a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, the United States, if it is to come, for example, to Taiwan's aid, will need to shift forces from the Atlantic to the Pacific. China's ability to disrupt that process could be done through its activities in Cuba, or as we heard at the February hearing of this very committee, through some of those controls of the ports at the strategic approaches to the Panama Canal. There are multiple important critical kind of choke points in this hemisphere that would be a part of that surge, that transition of forces from the Atlantic to the Pacific theaters, where China's presence in the Caribbean, as my colleagues have pointed out, would be incredibly important. So they would have the ability, in my opinion, to attempt at least to block some of that shifting of force from Atlantic to Pacific, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Berg, China's state-owned tech companies like Huawei and ZTE have played a key role in building Cuba's digital infrastructure. These companies are known to have deep ties to China's military and intelligence services, and their equipment has been flagged globally for creating backdoors enabling surveillance. How likely is it that these Chinese-built networks are enabling Beijing to conduct sustained cyber operations or espionage targeting U.S. government or commercial entities, either directly or by proxy through Cuban servers?
Congressman, I think it's very likely that that's what they're attempting. Excuse me.
That's okay. I've been called worse.
Excuse me again. Congressman, I think it's very likely that is what's happening. Cuba is offering China some of the best real estate that it can possibly have 90 miles off U.S. shores. And we've seen in multiple other instances how Chinese state-owned enterprises like Huawei and ZTE have provided a backdoor in other contexts, such as spying on the African Union and other organizations. So I see no reason to believe why we shouldn't believe that they're trying to do the same against the United States, their principal competitor in the 21st century.
Has there been credible analysis or confirmation that Chinese intelligence has used Huawei or ZTE-connected infrastructure in Cuba to intercept sensitive U.S. communications or conduct cyber? I mean, we believe they are, but has there been any analysis or confirmation?
Congressman, not on the open source side. What we've collected here is the facilities that we think are likely the Chinese are using, and we've done this in conjunction with some of the public reporting that's been done. In fact, drawing back to your previous question on Huawei and ZTE, Politico and Wall Street Journal, the two who were first to report on this, felt that there was a high degree of confidence that some of these facilities were in fact being used by the PRC because our intelligence agencies, again, this is reported in the open source, were tracking individuals from Huawei and ZTE coming and going at some of these facilities. But I think the answer to your question is more likely to be found on the high side, which is again why I've recommended in my testimony that all members of Congress should be able to get access to a classified briefing on this topic.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, the deeper China's tech infrastructure is embedded in Cuban society, the harder it becomes to unwind. I mean, that's true for anywhere. I mean, just look at London. Huawei technologies all over London. So this creates a long-term dependency that goes far beyond hardware itself. What strategic leverage does China gain over Cuba by controlling the architecture of its digital ecosystem?
Thank you for the question. I think it's crucial, and it's a central part of China's strategy. In Cuba, there's I think, a more willing partner that doesn't necessarily require this the same level of active pressuring or malign influence. But certainly building up capacities over critical infrastructure such as telecommunications for China puts countries like Cuba and democratic nations across the Americas at a significant dependence on the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the kind of thing that I think is a significant vulnerability, particularly in the case of conflict. But as we move, we've seen elsewhere the realm of economic and infrastructure capacities and influence being leveraged beyond that sphere into going into the political, into the even the military, where this capacity is then used to push governments to make decisions that are more favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. So it does create significant questions, particularly for the longer term. If we are blessed with seeing a shift in Cuba as far as a return to democracy, these will be challenges that a future Cuban government will have to confront.
You mentioned, actually in your answer, about how this could be in conflict. How could they leverage these vulnerabilities in a regional conflict or confrontation involving the U.S.?
Well, I think as far as telecommunications, this feeds into the presence in telecommunication infrastructure, and this feeds into a broader intelligence capacity for China, which is substantial, as we've discussed, going into signals intelligence, even into deep space monitoring. We also see a worrying buildup around critical infrastructure, maritime routes, where the capacity for disruptive action and subversion is substantial and could frankly cripple the U.S. economy and aspects of U.S. military planning, even limiting the capacity, for example, of transit for U.S. military resources and warships across, for example, the Panama Canal or other key points. So it's substantial.
I ran out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. This hearing that's kind of whets our appetite, and I think we're going to take Dr. Berg's your advice, and we need to go into a classified setting to look at the depth of this issue and how serious it is to American security, and get us some folks that can give it to us in a classified setting. And so I want to thank the witnesses for their time and their testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing report will be open for 10 days, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.